The Evaluation Cafe is a weekly series presented throughout the academic year that featured guest speakers on a wide range of evaluation topics, as evident in all our presentation last semester, and has been taking place at the Evaluation Center since the early 1980s. Though these have traditionally been a small in-person gathering that have been recorded and shared online, continuously from the last semester, this spring 2022 speaker series. While some may be hybrid, all events will be open to the public to join online regardless of location. For our sixth event this semester, we are delighted to be joined by our distinguished guest, Dr. David Saul. Dr. Saul is the owner and principal at Saul and Associates International. Before we get started, for those new to Eval Cafe, we typically have 30 to 40 minutes presentations or discussion followed by a 15 to 20 minute Q&A section. Like our previous event, our guest has requested that participants submit their questions in the chat box and at any point, so that he can pause every few minutes to respond to those questions. So before I get started, Dr. So, I just want to give you a quick 30 seconds to talk a little bit about your background and the kind of how you ended up today as the owner and principal at Saul and Associates International. Then at the end, you can proceed with the presentation.
Sure. Thanks and greetings, everyone. I've been in evaluation for about 20 years or more. Started out really as a program evaluator within a local school district and evaluating school district-wide programs. It was about a 40,000 student school district. And there were programs, federal programs, state-funded programs, you name it, all across the board, across various age groups. And since that time, I've expanded my work outside of education into other areas. When I went to school, I studied both measurement and evaluation. And so I've always kind of flipped back and forth between the two, doing work in both evaluation and assessment. And as a consultant, I always have the luxury, I feel I always have the luxury to follow my nose wherever it may take me. And then when things get a little dry, like during a pandemic, I might choose to go back to the classroom and teach a few courses here and there. But I have that luxury of being able to go in and out of lots of different spaces with my training and background and expertise. So some days you'll see me in the classroom, some days you'll see me at a conference presentation, some days you'll see me doing work on the development of assessments, and some days you'll see me doing evaluation work. It will all just depend, and it's kind of been that way for the last 20 years or so.
Yeah, I've enabled the sharing, so you can go ahead and share your slide.
All right, thank you so much. Well, I do have a lot to cover, so I want to just go ahead and get started. As we begin, I want to point out that this is more of a theoretical presentation that I'm giving today. I feel that it's important to ground ourselves in the theory before we move forward in describing the work. And again, I would like to reiterate that I encourage you to utilize the chat box to place your comments, your questions, your feedback as we're moving through the slides in kind of a real-time way. I don't know that I'm going to be able to see the items that come through in the chat, but we'll definitely get to them. We'll definitely get to them. And I'm hoping that what I have to share with you today sparks some ideas and some imaginings about assessment that maybe you haven't thought about or considered. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge the space from where I'm presenting. It's a space where the trees are red and the condors soar high above them. It's a space where the land meets the water and the water meets the sky. And that's the place where I'm presenting to you today. Before I begin, I always want to acknowledge my collaborators on the various assessment projects that I've been working with over the last several years. I consider my collaborators my co-conspirators, my co-disruptors, and my most favorite presentations are when I get to present with my collaborators side by side. And that's actually something that I'll be doing next week. The AEA, American Evaluation Association, STEM TIG, has invited myself, Dr. Carol Askew, Dr. Angelique Tucker-Blackman, to present our work on the development of the soul of HBCU STEM leadership assessment. And I can post those details into the chat later on. But again, I just wanted to acknowledge all of the wonderful folks that I work with, and much of what I have been learning over the last several years has been as a result of our collaborations. I consider myself to be a critical measurement and evaluation theorist. I didn't expect to be a theorist, but I became one through the conduct of my dissertation research. And I currently teach at the University of San Francisco critical quantitative methods, or quant-crit. Quant-crit is the convergence of critical race theory and quantitative methods. And I'm a consultant, and I do my work on the development of what I refer to as culturally specific and psychometrically valid instruments that are all about measuring progress along some type of a continuum. I want to speak a little bit about assessment within Indigenous environments. Now, for generations, for centuries, Indigenous peoples really have used a form of performance-based assessment practices in ways which today folks might label informal assessment. But these were not informal assessments. These are assessments that are quite formal and quite significant, and can lead to the development of individuals into various areas of expertise or knowledge, or even just family history. So whether folks are training to become hoop dancers, or training to build watercraft, or to navigate those watercraft using the stars, all of that involves some form of formal assessment. It's just that those assessments, in those assessments, there was not a single number 2 pencil, there was not a bubble form, there was not a scan sheet. This was all just done in a natural way. And I believe that many of us continue to assess in this way too. If any of you have children and we're trying to get them out the door this morning, there was all kinds of assessment going on as you were determining whether or not that child or all of your children were ready to go to school. There was a ton of assessment happening. And so I think that connection that we have with each other is grounded in a very different way of assessment than the way in which it's typically done, especially within school settings. I think it's important to at least start with a formal definition of assessment. For me, it begins with some kind of an attribute, something that we're trying to understand. And oftentimes what we're attempting to do is to get that attribute to emerge, to show itself, and to have it be represented through some kind of a process or a procedure, because we're going to be doing it over and over again. That's why we need a procedure. And then what we do is we translate the observations of what we just saw, and we assign value to it. I'm being very careful here not to say whether it's quantitative value or qualitative value. I'm just saying value because it could be either one, and that is our choice to make. And then from there, that allows us to make inferences about the attribute status. And finally, we do all of this in order to make decisions. The one thing that I like to add is that all of these things take place within some either named or unnamed worldview. And I also want to point out that this is one way of considering assessment, but there could be other ways. And so there could be another way to describe assessment could be that there's an individual, and then there's some engagement of that individual with trusted ones like elders or master craftspeople or parents or elders. But it's not enough that those individuals come together and engage with each other. Some folks might say we might need some kind of a spirit to guide all of this engagement in order for the assessment to have a space to exist. And then some might say that it's not actually a constrained space in which they're functioning, it's an unconstrained universe where all of this is happening. My point here is that there are lots of different perspectives on assessment, not just one. I like to situate my work and my research with the critical theorists, and I put together this chart because I was being asked a lot, what does my work have to do with critical race theory? And if I were functioning from a critical race theoretic perspective, then I would probably be situated along with the quant crit folks and the black crit, the tribal crit, the lat crit. Like that's the space where I would work if I were approaching this from a critical race theory perspective. But I'm not. My work actually flows through the work of Paulo Freire, and I am underneath I adhere to the work of Gloria Ladson-Billings and Stafford Hood, and so my work is more on the other side, and there's a difference. And I pointed out that I am teaching a class in Quant Crit at the moment, but it's very closely related to the work that I do. But the reality is, like, that's not actually how I view all of my work fitting together. This is more in line with how I think about it. I believe measurement falls underneath assessment, and that critical theory looks at our disciplines, and any discipline really, from this, what I refer to as this perpendicular or orthogonal perspective, because of that critique that comes with that approach. And so the critical theorists are often looked at, do they really belong here? Because they're always seem to be critiquing the work that we do. And so that's why I say it's this more orthogonal perspective on the discipline, but still part of the discipline. They're not outside of the discipline, they're in the discipline. And so once critical theory is located, then I now know where critical pedagogy is located. And that tells me where critical assessment and critical measurement are. And this is where I place culturally responsive assessment. And I usually say, I present every year at the Culturally Responsive Evaluation Assessment, the CREA conference. I'm always going to be hanging out with the CREA conference folks. So if you want to find culturally specific, just find culturally responsive, and it'll be a subset of that. And so it's not enough for me, though, to draw these pictures and just kind of situate everything. Like, I really, really want to know, like, what are the elements of this space and what happens in this space? And in order to do that, I needed to design and develop this theoretical structure that will allow me to answer these questions. In my work, alignment is a huge component. And when I'm working within indigenous spaces, it's often the case that assessments that are designed and developed for use within Western environments that have a construct, they have content standards, they have framework, they have forms of curriculum, instructional models, and then the assessment. But those assessments that are designed and developed from that Western frame get deposited within these indigenous spaces. And in 2019, I named that particular form of misalignment measurement disjuncture. And I want to be clear here that it's not just about the assessment, it's about the entirety of the assessment development process. That is off. So measurement disjuncture is the misalignment that occurs when any element of an instrument development process from one worldview gets applied to the instrument development process of another. And I just want to take a moment to point out that in order to convey the significance of this problem, I wanted to choose language that sounded really, really bad. So like the word injure and the word puncture or disjointed or disconnected, like I'm hoping that those kinds of words come to mind whenever I use the word measurement disjuncture. Like I want it to sound awful because it is. And but yet again, it's not enough for me to define it and then move on. Like I really want to know, as a psychometrician, why is this a problem and what should we do about it? Now, and maybe it was just because I've been working in indigenous spaces, but when I look at this picture, to me, it looks a lot like colonialism. And so I really had to dive into the literature on colonialism and took an entire class on it. And it was in that class where I learned about a particular type of colonialism called settler colonialism. And settler colonialism strives for the dissolution of native societies and the construction of a new colonial society on the expropriated land base. Shorter, that is the removal and the replacement of indigenous people on their lands. Now, in 2006, Patrick Wolfe referred to this as the logic of elimination. And the problem that I just showed on the previous slide is not quite to this level, but it's like that. And so I decided to play around with the language and came up with this concept of intellectual elimination. And what intellectual elimination does is it strives for the dissolution of native societies' knowledge and the construction of a new colonial knowledge in the expropriated minds. And this sounds a lot closer to the previous slide. And so let me give you a few examples of what this even looks like. So I dove through the literature, basically searching for ways in which researchers have conducted assessments within indigenous spaces. And here's the first example. It's called the Early Development Instrument, or the EDI. The EDI is a preschool assessment, and it's used throughout the entire world. In this particular article by Stonefish and Wilson, they described how a group of First Nations communities up in Ontario, Canada, had approached the developers of the EDI to create an add-on to the existing instrument that would be more appropriate for First Nations children. Now, the medicine wheel grounds all teachings of the First Nations of the space, which was Southwestern Ontario. And the four quadrants of the medicine wheel, in this instance, were to represent the physical, social, mental, and spiritual development of these children. Now, it's pointed out that they really actually did want a separate instrument. They really just wanted an instrument that was built on their philosophy, their way of thinking. And so when they met with the developers of the EDI, again, the standardized assessment that was in place, the developer said, hey, guess what, everyone? The EDI already contains sections on physical, social, mental development. And so it was determined that the EDI covered 3 out of the 4 quadrants of the medicine wheel. And based on this logic, 3 of the 4 quadrants were dropped from this new section of the assessment. Now, I wasn't there. I didn't sit in on any of the meetings. They didn't describe the meetings, but I can probably guess how this happened. It probably went something like this. They created a table and they said, okay, well, we've got the EDI categories here. We've got the medicine wheel categories here. And let's see what they have in common. And the part that's missing, that's all we need to focus on. I can almost guarantee that that's what happened. But what's wrong with this? Well, first of all, the medicine wheel as a construct is completely removed. The indigenous meaning of the 3 quadrants gets replaced with the Western perspectives on these similarly named domains. Being very careful with the language here. Even though they're similarly named, that doesn't mean that they're thinking about them in the same way. And it's here where I'm going to remind you that intellectual elimination strives for the dissolution of Native societies' knowledge and the construction of a new colonial knowledge in its place. Second example is from the very distant past of the year 2020, where the Lakota Women and Cervical Cancer Survey was written about by Bowker and Associates. Bowker actually developed the survey as part of her doctoral dissertation in 2017, and it measures knowledge, beliefs, and behaviors about HPV and cervical cancer. And the development of the instrument included input from Lakota experts, information extracted from a lit review, and years of personal clinical experience. It also included modifications from an existing instrument that was developed by Vance and Keel in 2013. And I want to point out that this is pretty standard practice. If you're doing a study, you will often go and search whether anyone else has an existing instrument. And if you can apply it directly without making any adjustments, you will. And if it's not quite appropriate, you'll make some slight modifications to it and then use that modified instrument. That is like standard practice. And so I thought, okay, I think it's going to be pretty important to figure out what is going on with that instrument. And who was that vulnerable population? Well, it turns out that the vulnerable population that instrument was based on was Appalachian women. So these are poor white women in the region of West Virginia, Kentucky. So how does that show up in the instrument work? Like, what did they do differently to make it appropriate for the Lakota women? Well, the items from the instrument for the Lakota women are on the right, and the items for the Appalachian women, the white Appalachian women, are on the right. On the left. Indigenous on the left, the white on the right. And the questions are practically the same. There's really not much that they did at all to modify it, let alone modify it to match the belief system of the Lakota women, which is the medicine wheel. And so again, I reiterate that intellectual elimination strives for the dissolution of Native societies' knowledge systems, including that about HPV and cervical cancer, and the construction of a new colonial knowledge system in its place. And then my final example revolves around a review of evaluation studies of Latinx mental health programs. Now, mental health screenings often are used for program evaluations or evaluations of clinical programs, but those are not necessarily responsive to the needs of immigrants from Mexico and Central America. They're just not. And that's because they failed to capture their cultural experiences, their values, and their knowledge. And so when I reviewed these articles, I wanted to see what evaluators were doing to contribute to this problem that I'm describing. And so I reviewed 6 program evaluation studies on mental health programs serving immigrants from Mexico and Central America. And these are fairly recent as well. And I dove into the methods section of these papers, and because I wanted to know what are the instruments that they're using to assess the mental health. And within these 6 studies, there are 22 different instruments that they use to assess the mental health of these immigrants. And only one of them is somewhat related to the cultural experiences of these immigrants. But it wasn't even a measure of mental health. It was a covariate. It was like, what is your family life like? So here's the part where I want to convey, the disjuncture, the awfulness of this. Think about this. These articles were written some of them were written during the last administration. We're talking about immigrants that are suffering enough mental trauma that they're going to seek help. They go and seek help, they get involved in a study, and then they get administered all of these instruments that are not taking into consideration any of the ways in which they experience trauma. Through assessment practices, we are adding to the trauma of these very, very vulnerable individuals. And so that's what I'm trying to convey with that word disjuncture. And yet again, where is the representation of mental health from the perspective of immigrants from Mexico and Central America? It's not there. It's actually one of the assessment projects I'm working on, is to design and develop such an assessment. Okay, so now we've gone through the examples. Let's speak a little bit about why it's a problem. Well, first of all, oops, let me go back. All right. I've heard many times from folks that doing this type of using assessments, external assessments, is like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. And I heard this so frequently that I decided, I'm just going to draw the image and see what I can learn, see what I can glean from the image. And sure enough, when I put the image together, you can see that measurement disjuncture penalizes individuals with limited exposure to the dominant culture, and that's represented here. But what about this space here? What's going on there? Well, that's where individuals cannot receive credit for what they know outside of the dominant culture. But to me, the most insidious aspect of measurement disjuncture is where individuals must change the complexion of their being in order to participate in the assessment activity. It's such an important point that I always have to stop and repeat it. Individuals must change the complexion of their being in order to participate in the assessment activity. I believe that this is very, very similar to what Frantz Fanon was writing about when he wrote Black Skin, White Mass, and what W.E.B. Du Bois was talking about all the way back in 1903 when he was speaking about double consciousness. Okay, so I know I'm not the first one to to recognize this as a problem because others have been working on this all the way back to at least the 1970s. But as I pointed out, I'm most closely related to the culturally responsive assessment work. And I feel that on its best days, what culturally responsive assessment can do is it can allow individuals to receive credit for the totality of what they know, and to do so in a way that allows them to remain true to their own identities. Culturally responsive assessment, I believe, has the potential to do that. But because culturally responsive assessments are often function within dominant structures, you're still going to have that gap. You just will when you're functioning within those dominant structures. And so what my work does is it just removes the dominant structure altogether. And when you do that, then you're working in a culturally specific environment. And so that's the difference I place between my work on culturally specific and the culturally responsive folks. So it was at this point that I really, really needed to establish a framing for what was happening, to place all of this work in. And I needed a framework that would accommodate the wide array of factors that are influencing the work of the assessment developers that I work with as we're actually building the instruments. And I was really wanting to understand what are the swirling forces that comprise the environment within which they work. So I knew that culturally specific assessments were a way to respond to measurement disjuncture. So that was part of the imagery that was important to point out. But I also know that measurement disjuncture just doesn't exist all out there by its lonesome. It's part of something larger. It's part of such things as settler colonialism and this concept of intellectual elimination. Intellectual elimination, I tend to point out, tends to occur within the discipline. It's within the discipline. But as we were building our assessments, these were not the only things that we've spoken about. We also spoke about such things as sovereignty and liberation and freedom and autonomy, like those kinds of very broad. And think about it in this way. In order to counter settler colonialism, like how far into the future do you really need to be thinking? Because it's such a powerful influence on all of us. And then to balance out the imagery, I developed a concept I refer to as intellectual amplification. And to me, this is where the environment of instrument developers exists. And I named this framework the disjuncture-response dialectic last year. Now, I do want to point out that I've taken a lot of assessment classes, taken a lot of measurement classes, and not one time did we speak about slavery. Not one time did we speak about settler colonialism or colonialism, any type of colonialism. Those things are just not part of the curriculum. But here I have been developing instruments, and those things are on our minds. Why are they not in the classroom? And so I believe that this framework provides a way to integrate these ideas into the classroom. And I also knew that my model didn't just apply to assessment. It applies to a wide array of fields and structures. And so I developed a more generalized model that I call the generalized disjuncture response dialectic. Okay, so it's at this moment, I want to do a quick pause and let you digest what I just presented before I go any further. And so let's just take a quick moment to do some reflection. And if you want to chime in, I have not had a chance to take a look at the chat, but if you want to chime in with any questions or feedback before we dive into some examples of what this looks like.
Hi, yeah, I had a question. Thank you so much for this presentation. It's very interesting, and I was just curious when you were describing the way that you were evaluating the different scales for the mental health assessment, what sort of qualities you were looking for within the scales that would have made them appropriate for a particular population.
I think I'll in the examples I'm going to provide, I'll give a lot more explanation of what that can look like. But all I had to go off of was the name, and then if I chose to do so, I could go locate the instrument. But again, that's the final product. My point about this is that too much attention is placed on the final product and not the process. So it's impossible for me to know what landed everyone at that final product.
Okay, I understand.
Yeah.
So you're saying more so you were looking for whether or not they were designed and developed for and by those people that they're meant for. Okay, thank you.
Let's see, I'm just doing a quick scan through the...
Yeah, there are some questions in the chat box. There's one from Desiree. She's actually asking that could you speak at a time when you or your team had to be pushed back on colonial assessment and how you advocated for culturally responsive or culturally specific assessment?
Yeah, one of the examples I share a lot is, so I was doing work on an indigenous language revitalization project, and they wanted, and they desired an assessment. And so when I first started meeting with the folks there, I asked, so what are you using now? And we were in a conference room, and there was a PowerPoint presentation. I gave my presentation, and they put theirs up on the screen. And they said, well, this is what we're using, and it's called the Common European Framework Reference for Language as the structural framework for the assessment that they were building. And I looked at that slide, and for me, like, the word European was just like in red, flashing lights at me, hitting me. I'm like, why are we using the European framework for an indigenous language assessment? And it took some time for us to move outside of that framework and arrive at the space where we can think about how that group perceives its own language. How do they want their own language to be represented in their own way? And that was the beginning of the development of the structure. Like, we had to let go. It took almost 6 months to do that, to let go of that framing. Okay, so let me dive back into a few more examples. I don't have a lot more time, much more time. And so these are some of the examples. I'll do my best to walk through them as quickly as possible. This one I share almost all the time. And this is about me preparing dinner at my house with my children. Now, it's very close to dinner time, and as I'm walking into the kitchen, I'm thinking, okay, A, what do we have in there that's going to become dinner? And B, what am I going to have all these children doing in the kitchen with me? And so I'm keeping in mind, well, we don't do these every single night, but there's a lot of things that we do a lot. And so I took those things and I started to arrange them into an order, because I have children at this, in this example, that range from age 5 to 15. So like there's a 10-year range. I can't give every child the exact same thing, and that wouldn't even make sense, right? I wouldn't assign all my children to do the exact same thing. There's just too much to be done. I need to spread them out amongst all of the tasks. And so I arrange them into a level of challenge, and then I can arrange them into categories, into ways in which they are related to each other. And so what I end up with is this developmental continuum of preparing dinner using categorized, ordered examples. And the examples are from our daily life. And then I know which child to assign which task. Now, it's possible that we have a visitor and I need that visitor to be able to do something. And so they'll also get to participate, even if it's just playing with measuring spoons. Now, some folks might say, wait a minute, I thought you were talking about preparing dinner. What does playing with measuring spoons have to do with it? Well, in my culture, having the baby there, sitting on the high chair, playing with measuring spoons, guess what? They're hearing all of the sounds, they're hearing the music that's playing, because of course we got music playing. They're smelling everything. Every once in a while, people are dropping by to say hello, maybe giving them a little taste of what dinner's gonna taste like. Like, baby is fully engaged in the process as well. And that's how they become inculcated to our cultural way of preparing dinner, starting as babies. And so this is the type of assessment that I like to develop, that I like to build. A second example is the use of rating levels. I think it's important to acknowledge that I'm not willing to acknowledge the absence of the trait or to state that someone has no amount of the trait. That's just not who I am as a person. So I tend to think about it like this. In this image, there's different degrees of sprouting of the flowers, and then there's one space right here where we all can see it's not a flower today. It's not, but we know that it's in there. And so when we're doing work on, for example, language revitalization and people and the trauma around language that exists, we know that it's in there. It may not be ready to come out today, but we are expecting that it will eventually come out. And so the rating levels that we develop for that particular instrument are based on that way of thinking. We don't have to call it none, or give it a score of 0. We can name it whatever we want to name it. This example comes from my work in Hawaii, and I was trying to convey the different types of measurement models that we can use. In this particular assessment, there's 3 domains referred to as Vaiano, Kilo, and Makabalu. And one option is a composite model where all of the items of the instrument are just kind of all mixed into one giant pot. And that's a composite model that we would use to develop the scale. Another model is a consecutive model where the 3 domains stand as independent domains. And then the final model is a multidimensional model where they are, yes, they stand apart from each other, but there is an acknowledgement that there's an interrelationship that exists amongst them. And so to help to convey, or to help make the decision of which model we were going to use, I asked them this question. How do you consider the Hawaiian Islands to be? Do you consider it to be one giant composite set of islands? Are they independent islands that really don't have anything to do with each other? Or is there some kind of interdependent relationship that exists amongst them? And so that's how we arrived at, we're going to use the multidimensional measurement model. through that explanation. And then this actually is a class activity that I used a couple weeks ago. And it's based on my work on the soul of STEM leadership. In that project, we're diving through interview transcript data and just trying to tease out all kinds of examples of what leadership looks like by diving through the data, the transcript data. And I wanted to convey to my students what that experience was like, but I didn't want to make it too complicated. I wanted to make it fairly easy for them to do within a classroom setting. And so I thought, well, let me pull up the lyrics to a song by Babyface. Babyface is an R&B composer, lyricist, producer, and he's been producing amazing music for, I don't know, over 20 years. And songwriters are able to do this thing where within 3 to 5 minutes, like they convey an entire message that is easily understood and often will make you start crying by the end of the song. That's how good they are at their craft. And so I thought, well, maybe I can use a transcript that is a little easier to work through. And so I pulled the lyrics to the song, Another Sad Love Song, written by Babyface and sung by Toni Braxton, and I shared it in class. And so with the question, what is the thing that Toni Braxton is experiencing? What is the thing? And that's going to become the construct. But in the class activity, I'm asking my students, what in the world is she experiencing? And so to do this class activity, I asked the students, first of all, to read the lyrics independently. And they shut off their camera and they read the lyrics, they came back on. And then they all listened to the lyrics in the form of the song by watching the video of the song. And then I paired them up into groups and I asked them this question. So what's the thing that she's experiencing? And I thought, okay, well, let's see what they come back with as the answer. Because I think I know the answer, but what are they going to say? And sure enough, they all came back with all kinds of different answers. We didn't get to have a formal debate. I think we're still in the process of reaching consensus on what she's experiencing. But this is an example of what I'm talking about, where we're really diving into the interview data or the lyric data, trying to understand what is the phenomenon that we're even trying to assess. And so that's how I teach about this. In terms of next steps, what I'm hoping to do next is to grow the case portfolio, add more and more projects, and to do knowledge sharing like what I'm doing today, and promote further collaborative research. And I wanted to end with something that I refer to as the Declaration of Autonomies. And that is that we assert the right to educate ourselves within our own worldview. This is the declaration of our educational autonomy. We also assert the right to develop assessments within our own worldview, and this is the declaration of our assessment autonomy. And with that, I want to close out my slides. There's my contact information. I will put that into the chat. We've got some time for questions. If you don't have any questions, I always come prepared. I even wrote some questions. If you don't have any, you can just read them. But happy to engage in conversation with you about this work.
I'll try to ask something, I guess. Okay, so the last example you showed that you're working on with your class, what would be the next step for you? You said you wanted to work towards a consensus. What would be your next step in doing so? And is that really what you want, or did you just say that flippantly? Because once you start moving towards a consensus, then somebody's culture is going to get left out. Anyway, but then where would you start?
Yeah, that's right. We're aiming for a consensus within the group. And I'm being very careful to point out that the cultural specificity can be defined in a variety of ways. It not necessarily related to the, the traditional ways in which we think about culture. But a group of folks come together and say, this is, we share common beliefs and ideas and goals, then that's a group that I can work with. But let's say that we ultimately figure out what Toni Braxton is experiencing. The next step would be to categorize all of the different ways in which we knew that, and how do we know what she's experiencing, and break it up into categories or not. Again, it goes back to the measurement model that we're going to end up using. Is it one big thing, or is it a series of smaller things? And if it's a series of smaller things, then are they dependent or are they independent? That's ultimately where it would end up.
Thank you.
I wanted to say something about the, thank you so much for a fabulous presentation. I think I have more comments if I can say something versus a question.
Sure.
I was just thinking about the last question, and it's amazing like how we are able to have, instead of thinking about my culture being denied in a one-off, like if everything is one-off, then I might feel like I'm missing out, but we can understand things as an aggregate over time. And I just think maybe like if that was done again, if I didn't get my part in for the first time, it'll show up, I'll get the opportunity next time, or maybe it's like a collective thing. So that just made me think about that in response. But the other part, I just really resonated with having to change the color of your spirit part that you shared, and how that can cut across all of us to participate or to be counted or given credit because of the disjuncture. You have to like color, you have to change the color of your spirit. I just really, I can hear that and how it doesn't, it just literally cuts across everything. Culture, race, ethnicity, gender. And I just want to say that.
Thank you. I see a question about developing inclusive assessments in a multicultural environment. I would tend to describe that as a more culturally responsive approach than a culturally specific. But in general, you got to go to the group and say, who are we? Who do we want to be as a group? What are our values? What do we consider important? But there has to be that acknowledgement that there is a group culture that is there. And without that first step, then yeah, it can look like you're trying to satisfy a whole range of interests that don't really have a direction, which is why it's important, why I always put that boundary around there and say, you got to name the worldview. You got to name the frame in which you're going to be functioning.
David.
Hi.
This is Lori. I loved seeing this. It's really fascinating. And I liked your, examples you used of your projects that, where you could really see the difference in what was being used or developed, what, how the voice of the people that it was supposed to be for was not included. I was wondering if you had any great examples of specific items that you came across in any of these projects that just really illustrated that worldview difference. that, you know, you could just sort of pinpoint where things came down to just not understanding. Does that make sense?
Yeah. In the Hawaiian example, there were 3 domains, Vaiano, Kilo, Makavalu, which, you know, don't exist as ideas in Western society, Western belief structure. They just don't. So how in the world is there ever going to be an assessment for those things that are important to that group of educators? They couldn't even begin to do that. And so in our work, I trust in my collaborators that they are bringing that knowledge to the table, and I'm bringing my knowledge of assessment to the table, and we end up constructing a whole new space that really hadn't existed before in the literature. But we join that path together. But that's a clear example. There's no Vaiano standardized assessment put out by the College Board. That just doesn't exist.
Can you kind of describe what that concept is?
So one of them has to do with keenly observing the natural world around you and making good observations of things that are happening. A lot of times, Western research is grounded in humans, in the human's perspective, and not so much about the perspective of the animals or the plants or the fish or the water, the air. Like all of those things can serve our understanding of a phenomenon. And so we should be very able to notice when things are off or going well or working well. And so it's a different perspective on walking through the world.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. So. Our time is fast spent. So thank you for joining us today, and thank you all for your participation. I'll be sure to register for the next week cafe, when we'll be joined by Dr. Laura Park. She's a principal scientist at ABT Associate Science Economic Policy Division. She'll be presenting on one career path with an example of what it's like to do evaluation in practice. I hope to see you all during that section. Thank you so much for today.